In the mental health field, too often, we've made it seem as if it's just in your head. Just in your head.
The landlord can hijack the rent by 20%. That impacts people's mental health.
Can't have a profit-driven mental health care system if we want our people to be connected and healthy.
Hello, this is Harriet Fraad, or if you want to be formal, Dr. Harriet Fraad, with It's Not Just in Your Head, and also Max
Golding, fancy therapist, LMFT, or Max. Just call me Max.
And me, Harriet. And today we are going to talk about cruel optimism. Now, what is cruel optimism? That would be the first thing. Cruel optimism is the name of a book by Berlant, Berlant. Now, I can hardly recommend the book. I can recommend the concept. And the book is interesting, but it is truly arcane, difficult to read, the kind of book that is written by and for other academics. And so it's not accessible. However, the concept, cruel optimism, is a very important concept. Now, what is it? That's important. What it is cruel optimism is the optimism that people are brought up with, what they will look forward to, that they're really not going to get because it's just not in the cards. And the United States is in a psychological turmoil and an intellectual and emotional and job and economic and political turmoil because the kind of optimism that we had, you can make it if you really try and so on, hasn't a snowball's chance in hell for most Americans now. And that optimism was basically, as long as you're white and in a family headed by a male, although I think minority children felt the same optimism, even though it was cruel optimism, but that if you're in a family, it'll be a stable family. If you're in a relationship, it will be basically a stable relationship. If you have a job, you will have job security, and you'll be able to look forward to a future in which you have the same level of prosperity, or even usually you look forward to a greater level of prosperity than the previous generation enjoyed. Now, why is this a cruel optimism now? And first I'll give a little overview, and that's because overwhelmingly, unless you've inherited a business that, from your father, or like Trump been given $214 million to make your way in the world, you will not do better than your parents. You will not have a stable job. Your life will be economically precarious. And the emotional ballast that you counted on to steady yourself, which is a stable family, won't be stable either, because relationships and families are also precarious. And if you looked for basically a precarious road, it would not be so cruel. You'd know what you were getting. But you expected a basically stable political system in the, quote, free world. You thought you would have the opportunity to have a middle-class life for the mass of Americans. But now, as Yeats said in his wonderful poem, things fall apart. The center cannot hold. And the center in America can't hold politically or economically, because our country is a declining empire that cannot admit to itself it's a declining empire. And so it's a little bit like England, with all of its imperial pretensions, which became a colony of the United States during Tony Blair and George Bush's regime, where England was thought of as Bush's poodle. And yet they have the Queen and the pretense. And now we have our flag, and we are supposedly the free world, but nothing's free in our country. A lot of people aren't free to vote, and inflation keeps going up, and we don't get much for free. And the free services that we do have and the free benefits like Social Security and unemployment insurance, thanks to the big government of FDR, are getting less and less available, and we get less and less for free. With a 5.4% inflation and no increases to these benefits, we're actually losing every year. So let's take them one by one. Let's look at the freedom we thought we had and the optimism we had for stable jobs where we could build salaries that accumulated, let us buy a home, let us have a little vacation, let us have children that could grow up and be more prosperous than we are. Well, that's over. The optimism remains, but it's a cruel optimism. What happened to make this cruel? Well, what happened is in the mid to late 70s, well-paying unionized jobs were outsourced, and we didn't have the kind of socialist, communist movements in our unions that would have forced it to be illegal to outsource, like there are in Germany, where unions are politicized and where the German metal workers won a 22-hour work week, or in Iceland, where they won a 4-day week, 8 hours a day, or even in Germany, where they now have a 4-day work week. Because in the 1950s, in order to counteract what was a real left move, we had big government regulating big business. We had FDR threatening the top businesses that they would have, and he imposed it, they would have a 96.8% tax rate, because right behind that was not only FDR, a sweet guy, were hundreds of thousands of people demonstrating all over this country. We had the CIO, which was recruiting union members in the millions in a big centralized union. We had communists active in recruiting in that union, and socialists as well. We had just come out of World War II, the victors with the Soviet Union, which paid a higher price than we did. They lost 30 million people, many of whom died in hand-to-hand combat in Russian cities. But we and they and the Soviet Union were the hegemonic powers. All the other economies in developed countries were smashed and destroyed by the war. And so we were the top of the heap. There was an endless market for what we had to sell, and there was great prosperity. And therefore, it was the time that the richest people in the United States decide, okay, we will never again allow ourselves to be taxed at 96.8%. Crush the left. And they began in the McCarthy era with the crusade against communism, as just because you were a communist, it was assumed you were in a conspiracy to overthrow the United States government. Now, there was no such tenet in communist ideology, but it was assumed, and it's kind of ironic looking at January 6th when they really were trying to overturn the government, and they're not getting very severe sentences. But on the pretext that communism was evil, and people went along with it, and the unions went along with it, and threw out the communists and made their fellow travelers, the socialists and the militant unionists, kicked out, which basically took the spark out of the union movement. And so it basically emotionally died Now people are trying to resuscitate it. But in the 1950s, 35% of the American labor force was in unions, raising the standards for all the labor force. Now it's 7% in private industry, and in the public sector, 9%. A devastating blow to labor. And so the 8-hour day can be taken away. And so people can be enforced overtime so that there can be the gig economy. You could work for Uber. You could work in any number of gigs and therefore have no limit on your work. Unions were dismissed. Capitalists went overseas because we didn't have the kind of militant unions and communist socialist movements that made it illegal to outsource. And so they outsourced the best jobs in America, for which you didn't need a college or graduate school education. The machinists, the factory operatives, and a whole generation whose children looked forward to stable jobs, well compensated overtime, the things that their militant unions had won, lost out. The jobs were taken away. And there wasn't the kind of political movement that would have forced our legislature to create laws to stop that, the way they did all over Scandinavia and in Germany. Just to give you an example, in Sweden, if you want to outsource a factory, you have to find an equivalent paying, equivalent condition job for every single worker in your enterprise. And so people who might find it not profitable to produce something find it more profitable to find something else to produce than to get everyone who works for them an equivalent job. So that we really lost out there. People were seduced by the level of progressive feeling, by the level of prosperity in an America whose competitors, Japan, Germany, China, all of Europe, were wiped out. And now, having outsourced the jobs, those people accruing millions and billions could take their money back to the United States and buy the political system, where there was no boundary against accumulating money and against paying for candidates, contributing to candidates. And the government and corporate enterprise worked together to make unions an enemy, to make big government seem like despots, even though it was big government that brought people Social Security, unemployment insurance, the Workers' Progress Administration, the small business and farmers supports, the artists supports, and what rescued us from the Great Depression. But they were successful. So by the time we had someone like Reagan, who they elected, who was outright anti-union, who began his tenure crushing the flight attendant strike and then went on to crush labor and he didn't do the kind of things they were doing in Europe at the time, which is creating a maximum wage after which all your money is taxed, or workers' rights, so that in Germany, when you have a board, corporate board, you have to have the neighborhood people who might be affected on that board. You have to have ecologists on that board to talk about what you're going to do to the ecosystem, and you have to have a union contingent on your board. It's not just capitalists who are making money off of this and have no other consideration but making money. So that the United States fell behind. And yet the optimism, you can make it if you really try, And you can be the, quote, bizarre idea of the self-made man. You can get out there, make $1 million, or get out there and have a stable job and have a stable family that disappeared, or really not disappeared with one poof of a wand. It atrophied. So that now the majority of marriages also end in divorce. And how come? Well, the 1950s stability was built on something which was really a bad deal for males and females both, but which gave a certain optimism to people and a great stability. And that is that if you were white and male, and the overwhelming majority of this country was white, you could make what they called a family wage, enough money in real dollars, what they could actually buy, to support a dependent wife and children, a wife who would work for you full time, creating cleanliness, cooked food, decor, childcare, emotional care, social connections between you and friends and relatives who she would entertain, and creating children and maintaining them. Now that's not available because women who now must work, 2 full-time workers don't make as much in real income, what they could actually buy, as one worker made in the 1950s. Now you need 2 people to work full-time to make less than one man could make in real dollars in the 1950s. And so women had to leave the household and full-time service for men in the household. What that meant was, overwhelmingly, women didn't want to go and work a full-time or part-time day outside of the house and then come home and do what Arlie Hochschild called the second shift. All the domestic labor, extra emotional labor to make her hubby feel better because he wasn't earning as much, childcare, connection with other people. That was too much. And so women no longer accepted it. Now, the majority of people who get married in the United States will see their marriages end in either legal separation and legal divorce, or informal separation and informal divorce. Legal separation is where people go to the courts, and they usually do so if they have money to fight over, if they have children whose custody to fight over, or anything else to fight between them. Now, 50% of marriages end in separation or divorce in the legal system, and at least another 15% end because people split and decide, okay, we've had enough. And increasingly, in about 15% of the cases, people don't even bother getting married. They just live in the same place till it doesn't work out anymore, and then they don't live in the same place even if they have kids. And so that optimism of, if you're a woman, I will be protected in a household in which I will labor for my husband and children. And for a man, I will have the optimism that I am an adequate provider, and I am a father, and I am a man with a stable, continuing job. That optimism is cruel because it's not going to happen. That it's overwhelmingly likely it won't happen. And yet at the same time, and this is where it's not just in your head really comes in, at the same time, that optimism fostered the idea that if this doesn't work out, there's something wrong with you. If the marriage doesn't work out, there's something wrong with the wife, usually, and the husband. If there's something wrong in your job, that you can't make a viable living, there's something wrong with you. Imagine how that feels if you're a couple, both of whom work full-time in minimum wage work, and you cannot afford a 2-bedroom apartment in any city, town, or county to rent in the United States, the whole United States. And you've been taught that if you're not making it, there's something wrong with you. Well, that's a devastating blow. And so increasingly, first, personal life breaks down. There's been a 30% increase in addictions just during this pandemic. There's been a huge rise in suicides. And by the way, both overdoses and suicides are undercounted. And people are desperate and blame themselves. And there's this whole self-help culture that has really encouraged them to do that. You just have to get in shape and have a positive attitude. Well, it's hard to feel positive when you're evicted, or when you lose your job, or when you see that Americans' top 10 billionaires have made $440 billion over this recession pandemic, while 60% of Americans have faced at least some unemployment, which sets their precarious finances back even further. And so that the optimism that we're all brought up with, that yes, it'll be there for me, isn't. And our culture tells us that it's our fault. There used to be an expression when I was a teenager, if you're so smart, why aren't you rich? Because obviously, if you're smart, you can be rich in this country, in this free country. And at the same time, we've been taught that America is the greatest, as Trump says. We're the greatest, the greatest. But the Chinese, who are fast becoming a dominant power, and the most dominant power they're becoming, though they're not yet, in the world, their salaries have gone up 4 times in the last 60 years. Ours have flattened in terms of the real wages, what people can buy. Their opportunities are growing. Ours are shrinking. And yet, we're fed that if our lives, our personal lives don't work, we know why. And if our economic lives don't work, we know why about that too. That's what makes it cruel. All the subtle little messages that one gets. If you try hard, you will succeed. And that song, you can make it if you really try. No. That never applied to minorities in this country with its racist history, and it never applied to women either. One of the reasons that, according to the very impressive case and decent studies, Southern white women are now dying faster than Black women. And they're dying deaths of despair because they thought they'd be supported for life by their husbands, these middle-aged and older women. But they can't be, and they're on their own. And they can't function. And the optimism that held together their lives is crushed. They thought their kids would do better than they and support them. They can't. They won't. And they see their children lost and addicted, coming home to live when the parents really can't afford it. You know, there's a cartoon where the kids are coming home to live with their parents with their suitcases, and the parents are just getting ready to move in with the kids at the door. They're saying, wait a minute, we were going to move in with you guys. Because that is cruel optimism. the optimism we have in this free country, which is great, the greatest, when actually our country is failing. Not only have we failed to give people hope and support and stability, we've also failed in the one area that we are the most successful in the world, accumulating arms. We are the biggest arms sellers in the world. We have the most munitions in the world. And we've either had a draw or lost every war we've fought in since World War II. Korea and Vietnam, there was a draw, and those countries were divided. All the other wars, latest being Afghanistan, longest wars, cost trillions of dollars, over 20 years, and the war in Iraq, we've lost. The Taliban is settling in. Iraq is completely destroyed. That our armaments did accomplish. We destroyed the most advanced nation in the Middle East, where 40% of the professional jobs were held by women, and where the religious mullahs were defeated, and so women could get more of a chance. That's done. So we do have the power to destroy, but not to win. That's another cruel optimism. I have talked to classes of high school students that don't know that we lost the war in Vietnam. We had to leave, evacuate in a hurry. Same thing is true in Korea. And we've lost all the wars since. And so what I mean by cruel optimism is that on a political level, on an economic level, and on an emotional level, we've been taught we will have stability. The family has been the biggest emotional pillar holding up Americans, and that pillar is cracked. The majority of families end in formal or informal separation or divorce, and our economic optimism, our children will do better than we did, that's changed. Our children can expect worse economic outcomes. And of course, there's individual exceptions. I'm talking about a mass level. And every symptom of failure is showing up. Now, it's particularly visible because if you look in the mirror of how we handled the pandemic, you see the disaster. You have to face it. It's America's mirror. That we have the most COVID deaths in the entire world, 609,000 deaths, and you know that that's fudged and it's probably more. And you have a profit-driven healthcare system, market-driven healthcare system that has failed the most vulnerable people. And you have an economy in which 10 billionaires made 440 billion, and the richest man in the world can spend 500 million flying himself into space for fun, while 1 in 4 children goes hungry, where people are desperate, where the murder rate is way up. On the 4th of July weekend, there was a record, 415 people killed by guns. The other symptoms of decline, overdoses up 30%, children forced into foster care because their parents are incapable, another 30%, and that does go along with overdosed parents and drug-addicted parents. You have food disorders, obesity rising meteorically, and you have homelessness out of control. In New York City, one of the problems for the census is that there's thousands of people living in the caves in Central Park or on the streets of New York City. And so you have collapse, and the optimism with which we've all been raised is cruel because it sets us up for a reality that isn't there. And so we have two choices. We can either look in this mirror at the disaster of America at the moment and say, okay, we can do what any sane, healthy individual will do. Look at the problem. Be curious. How do we get there? And how do we get that out? How do we get out? Or you can numb yourself and dissociate yourself with drugs and denial. You can also join a right-wing nation and blame refugees, even though this is a country of people who are refugees, all except the Native Americans who didn't get the vote in every state till 1965 and are the poorest Americans. So that blaming it on refugees, black people, uppity women, that's the Trump Republican way. Or you can have the way of the progressive Democrats and the socialists and the Democratic socialists. Let's face this. Let's look at it. Let's use our huge $1 trillion to tax the people at the top and create real possibility for people. Not a cruel optimism, but a reasonable optimism. And so that you have a polarized political system of fascistic Republicans giving the energy to the Republican Party, which is why the Republicans endorse them, and the progressives pushing a reluctant capitalist Democratic Party to a left where they don't want to go. And we don't have choices here in our free country. We don't have the freedom to elect the socialists on the ballot, elect the anarchists on the ballot, elect the fascists on, well, you have fascists to vote for on the ballot, although they don't declare themselves. And so we're in trouble, and we have to get over that cruel optimism on every level. We have to do what every client in therapy has to do. Say, okay, no point in making judgment on myself. Let's see how I got here. Let's be curious. What happened? How did we get here? And how do we get out? And then we won't have a cruel optimism. We'll have a reasonable, critical view of what's ahead of us. And so I think it's very important for us each to look at our upbringing and look at those forces that drove us into this cruel optimism. I remember at Public School 81, where I went in the Bronx, the optimism came out in all sorts of ways. We learned about American history, how the Pilgrims got here, and the Indians made friends with them and helped them, and they had this Thanksgiving, and they didn't mention that they then wiped out millions of Indians. They then shot those nice people who had Thanksgiving with them. They didn't mention that the West was done, another engine bit the dust. It's what you saw with the early programs. Not that, wait a minute, these people were here first. Columbus didn't discover this continent. There were people here already. And they wiped them out and tried to enslave them. And when it didn't work, they imported Africans away from their native land and native languages and forced them to work to make the capitalist slave owners richer. That we have to face it. We had problems then, and we do now. And we have to face them and deal with them. How did we get here? How do we change so that we're not trapped in a cruel optimism? And I think that's a psychological task and an intellectual task and a moral task that we now have as Americans. What do you think, Max?
Thank you for that, Harriet. I actually don't have a whole lot to add to that. I have to actually go earlier than usual, but I will add maybe sort of on topic that the reason I have to go early is I have scheduled with another member of my tenants union to go out in front of a grocery store where primarily monolingual Spanish speakers get groceries, so we can recruit for the tenants union. So the reason I'm giving that really concrete example is that's the way. The way that I kind of combat the cruel optimism thing is just by trying to constantly be engaged in that kind of activity. And so, the reason we made this podcast is to sort of challenge the mental health field and the sort of, neoliberal ideology that we're swimming in the concept of mental health being this very individualized phenomenon is we want to say that's frankly, that's bullshit. And the only way forward and making things better is together. And so, joining a tenants union may not be possible or maybe desirable to you, but there's always something to tap into that's beyond just believing that you as an individual need to fight harder and do better, because it's just not, it's patently false, and it's sort of ideologically, it benefits a really small number of people who are kind of out to get us.
And so the others pay the price of those benefits. If you look at mental health as a four-legged table, the table is built out of connection because we're social animals and we need connection. And one form of connection is intimate relationships. You can be really close to a relative or really close to a friend or really close to a sex partner, a husband, a wife. That's one leg of the table. Another is a slightly larger set of friends and acquaintances with whom you are friendly and supportive. Another is joining an organization, whether it's a PTA or a tenants union, so you get connection with something you're working on together, whether it's a blood drive or a political party or a tenants union or a podcast, something that you believe in that bonds you. And there's a fourth leg, which is that you're part of the world and you're connected to the world. And it isn't just you. You're part of something. And mental health has to do with connection. As is often said in the book Lost Connections by Johann Hari, mental health is connection. It's not somehow being happy because you have a workout routine or because you eat, organic mushrooms. It's because your life means something. For a lot of people, religion gives them some connection. And someone did a big study on loneliness, and they found that Trump supporters were the loneliest people. And what they found in Trump support was an ability to feel like they're part of something, part of making America great again. And they go from rally to rally, feeling like they're part of something. And that is what compels them. But we're asking people to join and connect on every level to make themselves better, to make America better, to make their communities better, to make their families better, and to basically have a therapeutic approach. Because when you go into therapy, one of the things you learn is don't be judgmental and mean to yourself. Don't pick that up even if that was your family's way. Be curious. What happened? How did I get here? What were all the emotional experiences and the physical experiences and the psychological and political experiences that put me here? And how can I make another road? So it begins with curiosity and then connection. Connection with yourself and connection with other people. And, there's a definition of trauma, which Gabor Mate has, to which I subscribe, which is trauma happens when people lose connection with themselves. They don't know their own feelings, their own needs. In order to be attached to people who demand that they are a rubber stamp for those people, or because they're in a traumatic situation and they lose contact with how they feel and what they need. They have endured a trauma. And the way to come back from the trauma is to know what happened and to be compassionate and connected with yourself. We need to thank our listeners and our Patreon supporters who enable this program. Go ahead, Max.
I actually forgot. Yeah, thank you in particular to First Winter, Sarah Turner, Rebecca Johns, Justin Harper, and Bandila MC Manga. And always a big thank you to Liam because he does everything on social media. And if you want to become a patron, you can go to patreon.com/itsnotjustinyourhead. And if you would like to email us with any kind of thoughts, comments, feedback, just email us at itsnotjustinyourhead@gmail.com.
And we will respond to you and welcome your input, whatever it is. So thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
Bye-bye.
By the way, listeners, if you have enjoyed anything you've heard Harriet say in this program, you will definitely enjoy Capitalism Hits Home, which is a solo program that Harriet does through Democracy at Work, which is a worker-owned cooperative that produces other great programs such as Economic Update with Richard Wolff and the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles with David Harvey. I can't recommend enough that everyone also listen to Capitalism Hits Home if you enjoy It's Not Just in Your Head.
Capitalism Hits Home is a sort of broader overhead view. It explores the way that capitalism shapes our personal lives, our psyches, our relationships, our families, and it looks particularly at the sea change in American personal life as all Americans, but the top 10 or 20% of Americans, have our security and our chance for a future become as precarious as it always was for minorities and families headed by women. It's not just in your head, and Capitalism Hits Home are definitely complementary.
And if listeners would like to check out Capitalism Hits Home, Harriet, where should they go to find it?
Either on YouTube or Democracy at Work or on my own website, harrietfraud.com.